Well, hello, it's your old mate Dave Spencer, speaking to you on behalf of the Online Transport Archive. We're going to bring you some of the films made by Martin Jenkins and Wilf Watters way back on VHS tapes. I think a few of them made it onto DVDs. And I hope you're going to enjoy this dip into the archive. The copyright has now transferred from Wilf and Martin to OTA, along with all their own material. And these were originally sold, but any profits made going to various tramway restoration projects. Now, as a registered charity, OTA may eventually gain from a viewership of these films. And we hope you're going to enjoy this dip into the past. We've tried to clean them up a bit and raise them to high definition for online viewing. And I hope you really do enjoy it. It's always a pleasure having all of you along with us. So all aboard for the old TARDIS and a trip down memory lane. And I'll catch up with you at the end. How's that? See you in a bit. Bye-bye for now.
On the 13th of July 1968, yet another of Britain's dwindling number of trolleybus systems came to an end. For 34.5 years, the trolleybuses had served the Yorkshire town of Huddersfield. Now the last routes were to give way to buses. To mark the occasion, this decorated vehicle toured the town for most of the final week, being specially illuminated at night. On the afternoon of the last day, thousands gathered to witness the passing of an era as a procession of 5 trolleybuses wended its way across the town. Despite many technological improvements, certain things remained constant during the life of the system. All vehicles were 7'6" wide 6-wheelers. None ever carried external advertising. None ever had traction batteries. And the vast majority were equipped with coasting and run-back brakes to cope with the many steep hills. Huddersfield owed its rise in fortune to the woolen trade, and following arrival of the railway, it became one of the most important towns in the West Riding. Reflecting this preeminence, it was the first municipality in Britain to build and operate its own tramway. Initially, steam and horse-drawn cars were used. This delightful wooden passenger shelter is a long-standing relic of the steam age. At the turn of the century, the system was electrified, some of the lines straggling beyond the town boundary into the surrounding semi-rural areas. A maximum fleet of 140 trams was operated, the latest dating from 1932. Between 1933 and 1940, the network was replaced by trolleybuses, both modes sharing facilities, some of which survive today. For example, the depot at Longroyd Bridge. And this strange indentation in the wall at Berkswell Slathwaite, which was formerly a trolleybus turning circle until 1963. And these former traction poles. In all the early official documentation, the trolleybuses were referred to as trolley vehicles, but to the local people they were always the trolleys. Rather than renew the life-expired track on the short Almondbury line, the council decided to substitute trolleybuses, public service starting on the 4th of December 1933. The route was worked by 6 experimental 60-seater double-deckers, which had a variety of different bodies, chassis and motors, which enabled the Transport Department to carry out a thorough assessment prior to placing any major orders. For example, number 1 had a Ransom, Sims and Jeffries chassis with a brush body, whilst numbers 2 and 3 had Park Royal bodies on locally built Carrier E6 chassis. All had regenerative and rheostatic braking, and all but number 4 were fitted with air brakes. For the 1934 conversions involving the Waterloo, Lindley and Outlane routes, 24 Carrier chassis were ordered, with the bodies coming from 2 manufacturers. Brush provided those for numbers 7 to 18, and Park Royal for numbers 19 to 30. To match seating capacity on the trams, all were over 26 foot long, which necessitated the use of the 3-axle chassis. There was now seating capacity for 64 passengers. Regulations also dictated that a trolleybus should be tilt-tested to 25 degrees with a fully laden top deck. 31 delivered in 1936 had an all-metal as opposed to a composite body. However, this failed to find favour due to corrosion and fracturing. The forerunner of the next generation of Huddersfield trolleybus was number 32 of December 1935, with its Carrier chassis, Park Royal body and Metrovic 95 horsepower motors. For the first time, the cream waistband was swept down over the front mudguards to merge with the cream front, and it was also the first vehicle to have the distinctive 3-aperture destination display. Starting with 31 and 32, all subsequent vehicles were delivered with coasting and run-back brakes, which were independent of the main power supply. 33 to 40, delivered in May 1937, were virtually identical to number 32. Following the decision to replace the remaining trams, 100 new trolleybuses entered service between October 1937 and January 1940. All were Carriers, the majority having Park Royal bodies. However, the most distinctive were 10 Weymans delivered in early 1940, which had a somewhat bulbous look and were nicknamed Messerschmitts after the German fighter aircraft, and probably because of their noisy English electric motors and contactors. They were also the last vehicles to have authentic Carrier chassis, as the firm stopped producing the E6 in 1940. At the end of the war, the corporation embarked on a policy of fleet renewal, most of the old tubs, as the earlier vehicles were known, going for scrap, but the 1934 batch 7 to 18 was sold to Reading Corporation, where the last of the 5 to enter service survived until 1956. In recognition of the role played by the trolleys during the war, when they transported thousands to and from work, and appreciating the part they continued to play as the core of the town's public transport system, the Huddersfield Cine Club made a film in 1950 entitled Ducks and Skates. Directed by C. Wadsworth, it provides an excellent record not only of the trolleybuses but also the town itself, when full employment was still the order of the day, when few people had cars, when most travelled into town for work, shopping and recreation, and before parts of the central area disappeared beneath development projects. The ducks in the title was the local name for the trolley booms, and the skates were the dead sections in the overhead, where passengers would notice the lights going out momentarily. By the time the film was made, all operational trolleybuses were housed at Longroyd Bridge. During the war, all the fleet had been renumbered from 401 to 540. Services were provided from approximately 5 o'clock in the morning until midnight. To reach the depot, staff either walked, cycled, or took one of the 2 special staff buses, the fortunate few being offered a lift. On arrival, drivers would first sign on and then collect their running board. Next, they would team up with their conductor or conductress. Most drivers had a regular mate, and the pair would be assigned to the same duty. Jimmy Sykes, who was a relatively recent employee, collects his metal ticket box, which contained a ticket machine, spare tickets and a waybill. He already has his leather cash bag. At the output board, they confirm their turn of duty, their departure time and their allotted vehicle. The star of the film had entered service on the 1st of January 1949 and formed part of 2 batches of new vehicles delivered during 1947 to 49. 541 to 592 were 30-foot-long 70-seaters with Park Royal bodies on Sunbeam MS2 chassis. Each had powerful 125 horsepower motors and improved braking. Everything all right, Mac? Then away we go. Driver MacDonald was regarded as one of the smartest among the staff. Jimmy Sykes would have been instructed in all the intricacies of the fare collection system in the conducting school. The new staff wait for Inspector Holbury to demonstrate how to use the new ultimate ticket machines which had been introduced in 1949. They had 5 columns of tickets, the values of which were a penny yellow, 3 halfpenny white, twopenny pink, twopenny halfpenny mauve and threepenny green. For values in excess, double tickets were issued, e.g. 2 twopenny pinks for 4p. The machine also printed the stage boarded as well as the class of ticket, e.g. ordinary, child or workman's return, the latter facility being withdrawn in 1956. The ultimates rapidly displaced the clumsier bell punches and also helped reduce fare evasion. In March 1949, fares had risen for the first time in 30 years, but they would again remain constant until the 1960s, when revisions and increases became more frequent. 541 to 592 were the last buses to have the distinctive 3 front windows and 3 aperture destination display. Here 570 departs for its day's duty from Longroyd Bridge. During the trolleybus era, the population of Huddersfield averaged about 128,000, many of whom were involved in the local woolen, chemical and engineering firms. They relied almost exclusively on public transport, and during the morning and evening peak hours, the trolleybuses operated every few minutes on each route, although during the rest of the day, headways dropped to an average of 10 or 15 minutes, with a few notable exceptions. For example, Waterloo had a 6-minute service throughout. Obviously, a cold day. Don't worry, there'll be another one in a few minutes. The post office red and cream livery with the wide cream band below the lower deck windows introduced in 1941 remained virtually unaltered until 1968, although the words Huddersfield Corporation were removed and recited in a new form on the lower red panels. To meet demand for new vehicles, but also to contain costs, the corporation agreed in principle to purchase 12 new trolleybuses every 2 years, and to extend the life of some pre-war chassis by giving them new bodies. This program of rebodying started in 1950 and continued until 1961. For example, 532, a 1939 Park Royal carrier seen here, would eventually receive a new body and be scrapped in 1963. It was always argued that the composite bodies of wood and metal were certainly prone to severe stress and strain. The more angular bodywork of the post-war carrier Park Royal contrasts with the rounded shape of the pre-war carrier Park Royal, passing an old Huddersfield police box. In order to demonstrate the speed and versatility of the breakdown service, this incident was staged at Sallandine Nook. Oh dear, a broken trolley head. Having removed the trolleys or ducks with the bamboo pole in order to allow other trolleys to pass his stranded vehicle, MacDonald phones control to ask for assistance. At head office, Inspector Harrison answers his call. Huddersfield had been one of the first undertakings to install shortwave radio communication between central control and its fleet of tower wagons. This enabled them to carry out routine repairs and inspections as seen here at Fartown Bar. Whilst also being able to respond rapidly to emergencies. Despite the surrounding hills, the shortwave worked effectively over the 42-mile network. The tower wagons formed part of an ancillary fleet of wagons, vans and recovery vehicles. This was a 9.6-litre oiled-engined AEC Matador with a Rawlinson body and tower. It had been delivered new in 1949 and remained until final closure, its last duty being to dismantle the redundant overhead. Although classified as semi-skilled, the men working on the overhead had to exercise due care and attention when dealing with the dangers of electricity. In 1950, part of New Hay Road was still cobbled. Approaching Out Lane terminus. Back in town, a constant convoy of trolleybuses passes the Old Market Cross. The wiring at St George's Square was redesigned as part of a traffic reorganisation project in early 1950. Orderly queuing was a legacy of the war years, and very often it meant a long wait, as buses were often filled to capacity. One of the early group of 1937 Park Royal carriers, 452, would last until withdrawn in 1953. Football was an integral part of the transport scene. On the 25th of March 1950, over 34,000 people watched the Huddersfield-Manchester United game at the Leeds Road ground. Officially, the capacity was 55,000, although 68,000 are reputed to have squeezed in during a cup semi-final. Many took advantage of the special trolleybus service, then at a flat rate of twopence. This information even being displayed in the route number box at the front and rear. After the match, the floodgates would open, with thousands streaming out to board the trolleybuses lined up in Bradley Mills Road. This formed part of a one-way loop serving the ground. As most of the visiting Manchester fans would have crossed the Pennines by train, the majority of the trolleys headed into town and the railway station. Every available vehicle would be pressed into use, and sometimes this could place a strain on the substations. .570 had now finished its tour of duty. Prior to signing off, Jimmy Sykes visited the cash office. Here he hands in his waybill and money, a mixture of copper coin and silver. This was checked by the cashier, who then passed the details to the comptometer operator. In the comptometer room, statistics were prepared showing the number of passengers carried, the miles operated, and the money taken. On a typical Saturday, the mileage would have been equal to one trip around the world. In 1948-9, the 140 trolleybuses carried 61 million people, the highest number ever recorded. They were truly kings of the town, running over 4 million miles, earning £367,000 and consuming nearly 13 million units of electricity. In 1950, General Manager Harold Muscroft and his traffic superintendent Richards could hardly have foreseen that the trolleybuses would be facing impending financial difficulties by the time of their retirement in 1958. In early 1949, the network had actually expanded. From Sunday the 6th of March, two short extensions, each approximately half a mile in length, were opened. One reached Brackenhall via Bradley Boulevard and the other Riddings via Riddings Road. As a result, the length of wiring along Ashbrow Road between Bradley Boulevard and Woodhouse Hill fell into disuse. The system now looked like this. Starting the rebodying program, between 1951 and 1954, 28 trolleys were given new 66-seater row bodies. New additions included 593 to 606, delivered in 1950-51. These 14 vehicles had 70-seater row bodies on Sunbeam MS2 chassis and were equipped with 125 horsepower Metrovic motors. 607 to 618 of 1953-4 had bodies by East Lancashire coach builders on BUT-type 9641T chassis and were powered by English Electric 150 horsepower motors. Further pre-war vehicles were now withdrawn, but 6 of the 1937-8 carriers were sold to Epsom and Ewell Council for conversion into mobile toilets, a role they conveniently played until 1983. (1955) saw the start of a 3-year rebodying program, during which 18 post-war chassis were given new 72-seater East Lancashire bodies. The first group was similar to numbers 607 to 618, but the final dozen had their upper deck sliding ventilator windows in different positions. As from the 10th of July 1955, the loss-making portion of Route 90 from Fixby to Brighouse was replaced by buses of the Huddersfield Joint Omnibus Committee. This 2.5-mile section had formed part of the last tram route abandoned in 1940, and as it operated totally outside the town boundary, rates had to be paid on the overhead equipment to another local authority. Bradford Road, Brighouse. This was site of the former tram terminus, the trolleybuses having been extended a short distance. Crossing Gooder Lane Bridge at Brighouse and Rastrick Station. Site of the Rastrick Reverser. Some of the uprooted traction poles were reused on the system's final extension, a short length of wiring built to serve a new housing estate on the northeastern fringes of the town. Opened on the 2nd of April 1956, the Keldergate extension was through-linked with Marsden as Route 40, whilst the original Bradley route became the 41. The short green lines indicate further extensions that were subsequently authorised but never constructed, due to a change in policy which was to eliminate the trolleybuses by 1968. Following the Brighouse closure, 6 pre-war buses were withdrawn, including 538. 619 to 630, delivered during 1956-7, bore a strong family resemblance to the 1953 BUTs, except that the sliding upper deck ventilator windows were positioned above the 1st, 3rd and 5th bays. "15 post-war sunbeams were rebodied between March 1958 and January 1960. The first 10 of the rebodied vehicles could be distinguished by ventilators built into the fiberglass front domes. All had 72-seater row bodies, incorporating cheaper, more cost-effective material. Whilst the last 5 had further minor differences, and could be identified by the absence of rear and front bumpers, now regarded as superfluous. 631 to 640 had the distinction of being Britain's last new 3-axle trolleybuses, as well as the last ordered by Huddersfield. Delivered at the end of 1959, they had 72-seater East Lancashire bodies on Sunbeam S7A chassis and 150 horsepower Metrovic motors. 7 of the post-war vehicles were virtually rebuilt during 1960. All retained the distinctive 3 front windows, but only 2, 541 and 544, kept their 3-aperture destination displays. The rebodying programme continued when 4 sister vehicles received new East Lancashire bodies in the spring of 1961. Despite all the improvements, the Town Council voted in April 1960 to abandon 13 miles of the trolleybus network by substituting buses on the routes to Fixby, Marsden and West Vale, all of which were claimed to be losing money. The last 2 also operated for a considerable distance outside the town boundary. Like the trams before them, the trolleybuses were now under ever closer economic scrutiny. Electricity prices were rising, and specialist vehicles and equipment were costing more and more. Buses, it was argued, were cheaper and more flexible. London Transport had also set a trend by deciding to scrap its giant network. Interestingly, second-hand poles from the capital were used in connection with construction of Huddersfield's Inner Ring Road. This mammoth project, aimed at relieving central area congestion, involved building a dual carriageway skirting the southern and western parts of the town, many sections of which would have to be demolished. For many planners of the period, the trolleybus with its fixed wiring was regarded as something of an obstacle, although every effort was made to accommodate the trolleybuses within the newly emerging road pattern. The first alterations occurred on the east side in the latter part of 1960. A new section of dual carriageway was to scythe through an old neighbourhood of closely built back-to-back property, and this signalled the end of the one-way workings on the Leeds Road route in Union Street and the lower part of Northumberland Street. Inbound buses last operated along the old wiring on the 29th of October 1960. This is the corner of Leeds Road and Northumberland Street, later renamed Pine Street. Outbound 40s and 41s last used Union Street on the 5th of November. Span wire construction was used on this portion of the Ring Road, together with some second-hand London poles. The old bottom end of Northumberland Street is on the right of the gas holder in the background. The wiring has all been cut down. Turning out of Brook Street onto Northgate. And then left along the new dual carriageway to Bradley. A new roundabout was built at the intersection of Northumberland Street and Northgate, being first used by the Leeds Road route on Sunday, April the 9th, 1961. A short distance to the south, another roundabout was taking shape at Shaw Head. New wiring was erected here in May-June 1961. To the southwest, the busy Chapel Hill junction seen here before rebuilding was also completely redesigned to include a roundabout. The Chapel Hill work was undertaken in the winter months of 1961 too. After only 22.5 years, the trolleybuses on the 5-mile-long West Vale route were replaced as from Thursday the 9th of November 1961. These midweek changeovers, a feature of the Huddersfield conversion programme, were dictated by alterations to crew rosters. Outbound along Halifax Road, the trolleys displayed 30, 31 or 32, whilst those working into town showed 30. The outer 2 miles of the West Vale route lay in Elland Urban District Council, and included some of the bleakest terrain tackled by British trolleybuses, as well as a variety of different types of wiring. For example, bracket arms were used on the one-way terminal loop. On Long Wall, West Vale, both catenary span wires and tubular suspension were used. On the narrow section of Victoria Road, Elland, from Burley Street to its junction with Jepsom Lane, bracket arms were needed. As trolleybuses were not permitted to pass each other here, movements on the bend were controlled by signals activated from the overhead. Elland, also terminus for the short working 31. An inbound 30 on the Ainleys, close to Sharratt's Brickworks. The coasting brake governed speed on the descent from Ainley Top to the brickworks at 15 miles an hour. This was the only place where release of the brake did not correspond with a public stop. On the ascent, the trolleybuses would easily have overtaken the motorbus. The wiring on either side of the 2 bridges in Huddersfield Road, Ainley Top, was supported by tubular suspension. This area has all disappeared under the M62. The traction pole at the junction of New North Road with Trinity Street was actually embedded in the roof of the railway tunnel, running directly beneath, and it dated from electrification in 1900. Negotiating the frogs leading from Westgate into New North Road. Lyceum Junction and Almonbury. With the end of through running to West Vale, the Almonbury portion now terminated in the town centre at Byram Street. In the first few months of 1962, a further 4 new 72-seater East Lancashire bodies were placed on rebuilt MS2 chassis. These were numbers 582 to 585. Among vehicles withdrawn were some of the first to be rebodied after the war. For example, 492 had a 1951 row body on a 1938 chassis. Public concern was expressed when in October 1962 the Council approved by a single vote to replace the entire system over a period ranging from 10 to 20 years. This followed recommendations made by the General Manager, who had argued that buses were cheaper to purchase and operate, that the maintenance of the electrical infrastructure was an increasing financial liability, and that manufacturers might stop making trolleybuses. After several postponements due to shortage of new buses, the long 7-mile Marsden line was replaced as from the 31st of January 1963. The route served the mill towns along the Colne Valley, and when the trams had been replaced in 1938, the trolleybuses had been extended at the Marsden end. Overshadowed by Bank Bottom Mills, a 40 turns on the loop at Fall Lane. Since 1956, the 40 had provided a 10.5-mile cross-town link, operating every 15 minutes, increased to 7.5 minutes at peak times. A sharp right-angle bend led from the relative tranquility of Fall Lane onto the busy A62, which before the building of the motorways was frequently clogged with lines of slow-moving traffic. A friendly driver acknowledges the photographer standing by the gasworks in Manchester Road, Marsden. This reverse curve at Sellers Clough forced the trolleybuses to reduce speed. Manchester Road at West Slathwaite. Berkswell, Slathwaite. This was terminus for the 8.5-mile cross-town 41. This shared common wiring with the 40 for most of its length. The trolleybus turning circle indentation still survives today. The Griffin Junction. The winter of 1962-3 was one of the harshest in living memory, and these views, taken shortly before the last day of operation, capture the exposed nature of much of the Marsden route. Intending passengers frequently had to huddle for shelter against the biting winds and driving snow. Linfit Steps. The Marsden route was probably the fastest on the system. Here a trolley hurries along the open section between Hoyle House and Slathwaite. Approaching Hoyle House inbound from Marsden. The Royal Oak Linthwaite with a Hanson-owned single-decker bus. West Mount. To enable the trolleybuses to overtake slower, high-loaded vehicles, the wiring on Manchester Road had been relocated closer to the centre of the carriageway, as clearly demonstrated here. Some 4.5 miles from Marsden was Spurn Point, which marked the boundary between Huddersfield and the Colne Valley Urban District Council. After the abandonment, traction poles carrying street lighting were left in situ, those beyond Spurn Point being acquired by the Urban District Council, of which some remain in use in 1995. From here, it was 1.5 miles to the Griffin. The last trolleybus to make the trip along the Colne Valley was MS2 560. A major route reorganisation followed the Marsden closure. These views show 41s at Bradley setting off for the Colne Valley. But as from the 31st of January 1963, they would be diverted to run to Longwood. No new wiring was involved. A 40 leaves Keldergate for Marsden. The youngsters are much more interested in the photographer than the trolleybus. As a result of these alterations, the 90 was discontinued, the Fixby portion being covered by a new cross-town service 34, for which some additional wiring was required. Progress on the Inner Ring Road had also led to changes. This curve led from Southgate into Kirkgate, which was last used in September 1962. The outbound wiring on Southgate was last used in July 1963. The new telephone exchange rises behind the doomed Tudor-style Oxford Hotel. From the 21st of July, outbound Waterloo and Almondbury services used new wiring along Oldgate to reach the Shorehead roundabout. For its 1963 Civic Week celebrations, the corporation borrowed a mock-up of a Yorkshire Woollen District tram. In reality, it was a rebuilt Leyland double-decker bus, but complete with reverse stairs, lifeguard, headlamps and controller, and painted in the old Yorkshire Woollen District livery of dark red and cream. 4 interesting hybrids entered service during 1963. For example, this body was placed on a rebuilt MS2 chassis. As from the 6th of February 1964, the crosstown Birkby-Crossland Hill Service 60 was replaced by buses, another 3 route miles being abandoned. Both prongs were predominantly residential and have been served by trams until the latter months of 1937. Serving the moors and the nearby cluster of stone quarries, the Crossland Hill trolleybus loop lay a little beyond the former tram terminus. It had originally consisted of a reverser. It was reached following a steep climb of over a mile up Blackmore Foot Road. 2 vehicles passed close to Francis Avenue. The reverser at Crossland Moor, site of the old tram terminus, had been regularly used by short-working 61s until 1957. The gradient on this part of Blackmore Foot Road required the use of the coasting brakes. Originally, the restriction had extended as far as the Griffin, but following representations was curtailed at Park Road West. Ascending the hill, trolleybuses frequently surge past the slow-moving buses, grinding their way up the incline, the ruling gradient being 1 in 11.8. Approaching Park Road West. In the town centre, a Birkby-bound 60 passes the George Hotel. The carriageway under this railway bridge at St John's Road had to be lowered in 1937 to provide additional headroom. 2 views on St John's Road. Birkby Hall Road. This narrow portion of Birkby Hall Road was dubbed the Switchback. It included some grades of 1 in 12. The 60s terminated at Fartown Bar junction with the trunk Bradford Road routes. Trolleybuses had ceased to serve the nearby Rugby League ground in January 1964. Despite this closure, Fartown Bar would remain an impressive trolleybus junction. Snow could cause severe problems for the trolleys, especially on grades like Blackmore Foot Road. On this occasion, the snow was not of sufficient depth to present real difficulties. This driver will just have engaged the coasting brake for the descent down to Park Road West. One downside of the original coasting brake arrangement had been that once it was engaged, it prevented the use of the rear static brake, which was ideal in icy conditions, as it was virtually incapable of causing a skid. This had been rectified in 1951, when modifications allowed both brakes to function simultaneously. The run-back brake reduced speed to 2 miles an hour in case of a runaway. One can almost feel the cold as passengers slip and slide across the treacherous surface. Fog could also cause problems. To guide drivers round particular hazards, strings of lights were suspended between the overhead. However, it was rare for them to be filmed in use. This sequence taken on Manchester Street shortly before it was closed to trolleybuses in March 1964. Following the February closures, 16 more vehicles were withdrawn, all MS2s dating from 1947 to 1949. 4 still had their original Park Royal bodies, although much rebuilt. And one of them, 541, was acquired for preservation by the National Trolleybus Association. The remainder had all been rebodied either by Roe or East Lancashire between 1955 and 1959. Included was 570, the star of Ducks and Skates. Here they were filmed at the premises of Lockheed Limited in company with a Hull trolleybus, awaiting their ultimate fate. .549, one of the remaining MS2s, was hired by the Huddersfied Trolleybus Preservation Society to tour the system on the 24th of May 1964. This was one of the 7 vehicles virtually rebuilt in 1960, and one of the 5 to lose the characteristic 3-aperture destination display. As no Huddersfield trolleybuses had batteries, all movements without wires were either by gravity or hard graft. However, being a Sunday, the power was off in the vicinity of Great Northern Street Works, so 549 had to be manhandled into Ray Street. In the vicinity was the railway line serving the Corporation Gasworks. This train of coke was being hauled from the gasworks towards Newtown Yard, terminus of the former Midland Railway branch from Murfield. Beaumont Street. The trains were worked by a pair of Andrew Barclay 040s of 1922, and this fascinating operation survived until April 1966. Crossing Leeds Road complete with red flags into the gasworks. During 1963, all the 1956 BUTs were overhauled and repainted to the usual high standard, each emerging without front and rear bumpers. Most enthusiast tours involve some coasting manoeuvres. Here, freshly overhauled 630 is seen at 3 different locations. First, on the unwired curve leading from Bradford Road onto the Brackenhall branch. Secondly, dropping down from Keldergate onto Leeds Road. This was a favourite manoeuvre and was included in most Huddersfield trolleybus tours. finally turning off Leeds Road onto the ICI loop at Woodland Road. The P-car-only route 72 was replaced by buses as from the 28th of January 1965, although the loops at both Marsh and Mole Green were retained for emergency use. "549 was among 6 vehicles to be withdrawn. This left just 2 trolleys still with Park Royal bodies, one of which, 590, had participated on an enthusiast tour on the 31st of March 1963. Here it's seen in Bradley Mills Road, part of the football loop, which was de-wired in April 1965. On the same tour reversing at Newsham Church. And at Longwood. The long drawn-out Wakefield Road improvement scheme started in 1964. It was part of an overall plan for a dual carriageway and involved rebuilding Somerset Bridge. The Lyceum Junction was also to be remodelled. The upheaval resulted in major delays to the trolleybuses. The Almonbury-Fixby closure involved the first trolleybus route opened in 1933, as well as part of the last tram route to be converted in 1940, a further 2.5 route miles falling into disuse. Almonbury, with its 12th century church, was a very ancient settlement, mentioned in the Domesday Book. The top of Somerset Road. The gradient on Somerset Road varied from 1 in 15 to 1 in 30. Near Waste Lane substation, note the feeder. Foxglove Road. Longley Road. These views were taken some time before the final abandonment. Foot of Dog Kennel Bank. Lyceum Junction. Outbound to Almonbury at Lord Street. On the north side of town, an inbound 34 descends Bradford Road, passing the site of the Fixby tram reservation abandoned in 1940. These next sequences were taken some years earlier, when the Fixby section was still served by Route 90. Fixby Road. The terminal reverser at Lightbridge Road. The last 3 windowed Park Royals were among 16 vehicles withdrawn. The remainder being rebodied MS2s. The fleet strength had now dropped to 52 vehicles. Amongst buses withdrawn was Showbus 593, seen here at Brackenhall. It had been lined in gold when built and exhibited at the London Motor Show in 1950. The 2 heavily used cross-town routes 10 and 20 shared common wiring from Far Town Bar to Folly Hall, the 10 running from Brackenhall in the north to Lockwood in the south, with the 20 linking Riddings to Newsham south. The 20 was of historical significance, as it was the last Huddersfield route to require the use of coasting and run-back brakes. Both services operated for the last time on Wednesday the 13th of July 1966. Bradley Boulevard, with an inbound 10 en route to Lockwood. Note the air raid shelter still in situ. This was one of the post-war extensions built to serve new housing development. Ashbrow Road in the foreground had formerly been served by trams and then by trolleybuses until 1949. An inbound 10 curves down to link up with Bradford Road at Smithy Junction. Also serving the northeast suburbs, the 20s left Riddings terminus by way of Riddings Road. This section from Ashbrow Road to Riddings had opened in 1949. At this point, drivers would have engaged the coasting brake for the descent down Woodhouse Hill, which included one section of 1 in 8.3, the steepest on the system. MS2 600 was eventually to be the last trolleybus to descend this stretch of wiring. Fartown Bar, junction with the 10. Just south of Fartown Bar. Despite the rundown, there was still an intensive service through the town centre. This is the marketplace. Lockwood Bar. From Folly Hall, the 10s had followed the former Honley tram route. but owing to the existence of a low railway arch, had to be curtailed at Lockwood. Lockwood Road. Bridge Street. And some 1.5 miles from the centre, Lockwood Terminus. At Folly Hall Junction, the 20s had diverged to turn east before crossing the Colne River at Damside. From here, they started the climb to Newsham Church. Purring majestically up Newsham Road, probably at about 20 miles an hour. Tunnicliffe Road. Approaching Newsham Church. The section beyond the church through the plantation had not been served by trams, so when the trolleybuses were extended a further half mile, the Transport Department simply invented the name Newsham South. The reverser at Caldercliff Road. Newsham Church reverser. On the descent, the coasting brake was applied at Dawson Road and released at Stile Common Road, a distance of just over 1,000 yards, the maximum grade being 1 in 10.6. Until 1949, the restriction had extended to the foot of the hill at Kings Mill Lane. Just before midnight on the 13th of July, BUT 629 made the final trip on this, the first coasting brake section in Huddersfield. Following withdrawal of another 16 vehicles, including the last of the 1951 row-bodied MS2s and the first of the 1953 BUTs, the active fleet was now reduced to 7 MS2s, 18 BUTs, and the entire batch of 1959 S7As. All repaint ceased by June 1966, and all major engineering by the November. The driving school closed at the end of the year, and by the following spring there were only 31 drivers and 44 conductors. As 1967 progressed, those trolleys with mechanical defects or accident damage were simply withdrawn, so that by June 543 and 546, two of the surviving MS2s were off the road. Because they passed close to the depot, it had been planned that the 40 and 41 would be the last routes, but road widening along Leeds Road hastened their demise, the closure date being given as Wednesday the 12th of July 1967. On the previous Sunday, the only serviceable MS2 made a nostalgic tour of the network. It had been specially kept in working order for the occasion. The Sunbeam chassis dated from 1947 and the East Lancashire body from 1961. 2 days after the tour, 548 was withdrawn following a motor failure. The cross-town routes 40 and 41 were replaced by buses as from Thursday the 13th of July 1967. Both operated every 15 minutes, and there were intensive peak hour extras, especially along Leeds Road, where short working services 42 and 44 were also replaced. At Bradley, the 41s turned just short of the borough boundary, crossing the trunk Huddersfield Leeds Road. Approaching the junction with the 40. On the corporation's last trolleybus extension. Keldergate, terminus of Route 40. Running back down to the main road. In tram days, this area had been known as Cinderfield Dyke. When the trams were phased out, a railway bridge at this site had been demolished, as the trolleybuses required a clearance of 17 foot 6. Another bridge, some distance down the road, carried the freight-only Kirkburton branch, and here the carriageway had to be lowered. The trolleybuses were still reduced to a virtual crawl in order to pass beneath. Close by was the Huddersfield Broad Canal. Passing Woodland Road, outer limit of the loop serving the ICI works. This in-town portion of Leeds Road was one of the busiest thoroughfares, with a collection of mills, factories and works, as well as rows of tightly packed terraced houses. Trafalgar Mills are in the background. On alternate Saturdays, scores of trolleybuses had once ferried thousands to watch Huddersfield Town. Rounding St George's Square. Side bracket arms on Longroyd Lane. on the west side of town at Church Street, Paddock. Approaching Paddock Head, outbound to Longwood. Bungalow Bakery. The viaduct in the background was on the main Manchester-Huddersfield Railway. The final mile and a half of the Longwood route was particularly spectacular, with hairpin bends, a narrow village street, an old turntable, and some steep gradients, which had originally carried coasting brake sections. Approaching the right-angle bend at Quarmby Clough. The Victorian mill building owned by Joseph Hoyle and Sons has since been demolished. The gaunt chimney of Prospect Mill glowers over Longwood Gate. Although officially forbidden to pass on this stretch, the Ministry of Transport prohibition tended to be ignored. Note that the side bracket arms are supporting all 4 wires. When the trams were replaced in early 1939, engineers had found difficulty in providing turning facilities for the trolleybuses. Because of the steep hillside, it had proved impossible to build a reverser or a turning circle, so a manually operated turntable, similar to that at Christchurch, Bournemouth, was originally installed. The concrete platform thrust out over the hillside was later adapted for use as a conventional reverser. This view shows the elevated position of the platform. On the 13th of February 1967, 634 plunged 20 foot into the field below after its crew failed to observe the correct reversal procedures. The last vehicle to use the reverser was S7A 636 at 11:23, and the last along Leeds Road was BUT 624. Inroads were now made into the 1953 BUTs. Amongst those withdrawn was number 613. The network had now shrunk to just 9 miles, with 11 BUTs and 9 S7As. The layout remaining in the town centre included wiring providing access to and from the depot, as well as the Northumberland Street-Byram Street loop, for which the curve, shown in orange, had been installed as late as July 1967. The final length of new wiring came into use on August the 6th, 1967, and was erected for use by outbound trolleybuses using the reconstructed span of Somerset Bridge. The Wakefield Road Improvement Scheme had taken an incredible 3¼ years. On the 22nd of June 1968, a centenary pageant was held to commemorate Huddersfield's 100 years as a municipal county borough. A succession of floats representing different historical periods paraded through the town. At the head of each group was an appropriate means of transport. First came a steam tram and trailer, built around a Land Rover and a 4-wheel passenger car. Next, an electric tram, in reality an adapted motorbus on loan from Halifax. 631, somewhat ignominiously towed by a tower wagon, represented the trolleybus era. and finally a Fleet Line motorbus. With the end now in sight, different aspects of the trolleybus scene were documented for posterity in a film called Silent Service. A conductor guides the trolleys onto the overhead. Imagine doing this at night or in fog. Since the war, all the trolley heads have been fitted with carbon inserts, which reduced wear and tear, sparking, dewirements and trolley wheel screech. The power supply to the overhead was by direct current, flowing in one direction through the positive wire and returning through the negative wire positioned on the near side. To allow the current to be cut off in emergencies, the positive wire was interrupted approximately every half mile by section insulators, past which the current could only flow through a switch in a section box on the roadside. This was a typical mercury arc rectifier substation. In 1960, there have been 28 substations, generating a maximum of 9,000 kilowatts of power, equal to 12,000 horsepower at 600 volts DC. There was also 100% overload capacity for 15 seconds. Fortunately, not every trolleybus required full power at the same time, although it did allow them to tackle gradients of 1 in 10 at just over 22 miles per hour. During the last complete year of trolleybus operation, ending the 31st of March 1968, the remaining handful of vehicles consumed 2.5 million units of electricity, equal to 4.3 units per mile. They operated nearly 600,000 miles and carried just 9 million passengers. It was a long way from the heady days when 20 years earlier, nearly 7 times that number had used the trolleybuses. The positive and negative wires had originally been only 18 inches apart, but except in a very few instances, this had been widened to 2 feet before the war. The main east-west artery was scheduled to operate for the last time on Saturday the 13th of July 1968. The 71 and 73 ran together from Waterloo across town to Bay Horse Junction, where the 71 diverged to Lindley, with the 73 proceeding to Out Lane. The peak-hour-only 74 provided additional capacity on the western limb. Out Lane was situated 909 feet above sea level, the highest point reached by trolleybuses in the United Kingdom during the life of the Huddersfield system. To reach the terminus, the 73s climbed steadily for 4 miles from the town centre. These folk are well wrapped against the cold. This was the site of the original tram terminus. Two 73s pass at Leach's Hill. This area was totally transformed during construction of the M62 motorway. The open part of New Hay Road at Longwood Edge. Note the feeder from the Mount substation in the background. The junction wiring led into Sallandine Nook School Loop, built in 1958, and still served by journeys on Route 74. Outbound from town, BUT 620 approaches Bay Horse Inn, junction for the 71 to Lindley, and short working still using Marsh Loop, former terminus of Route 72. Turning from Acre Street onto the one-way loop. rounding the sharp bend from Wellington Street into Gibson Street. Gibson Street at the junction with New Hay Road. On the Linley Terminal Loop. The famous clock tower in the background dominated this section of Acre Street, Linley. Rejoining the 73 at Bayhorse Junction. Running repairs to an outbound 73 on New Hay Road. The carriageway at Gledholt had been widened as early as 1937 when the tram tracks were lifted. Descending Trinity Street, also widened in 1937. Form a junction with the West Vale routes. (629) negotiates the junction with Railway Street. This provided access into the depot at Longroyd Bridge. At the depot, a 74 emerges for peak hour duty. New Street was now only used by those trolleys working to and from the depot. On the curves in front of the town's magnificent station. Back at Westgate, with the 74 offloading prior to running into the depot. Marketplace. Overlooked by the parish church of St. Peter, an outbound 73 heads towards Waterloo, a distance of just 2 miles. Circumnavigating Shore Head roundabout. Note the front-loading double-decker bus owned by County Motors. Two views now on Wakefield Road at Mould Green. Running alongside Ravensknoll Park. Approaching Waterloo Terminal Loop. Turning here from Penistone Road onto Mitchell Avenue. With 2 routes, each on a 20-minute off-peak headway, passengers enjoyed a 10-minute service into town. With the closure coming ever closer and closer, several enthusiast tours were organised. On Sunday the 7th of July, 2 BUTs were used. 629 is seen at Oaks alongside Crosslands Mill, formerly served by tramway-owned coal trucks. Sallandine Nook Loop. The threepenny fare in the destination box was formerly used on football specials. Playing silly beggars as 628 runs round Marsh Loop, but in the wrong direction. Wellington Street with the booms anchored down. For the final week, a range of souvenir tickets was issued. The illuminated trolleybus 623 was used in public service from Monday the 8th of July, giving everyone an opportunity for a last ride. With its white trolley booms and scores of coloured light bulbs, the 11-year-old BUT looked very smart indeed. It was destined to make the final ceremonial run on the Saturday afternoon. At night, it blazed an unforgettable trail along the glistening wires. The ducks pass under a skate. On the final day of full service, Friday the 12th of July, 12 out of the 14 available trolleys were used. These scenes are of reversals at Sallandine Nook. On Saturday morning the 13th, most journeys on the 71 and 73 were worked by brand new Daimler fleet lines. Only a somewhat shabby Sunbeam number 640 and BUT 629 were to be found at work. During the morning, they were joined by the preserved carrier 541 on a tour under the auspices of the National Trolleybus Association. Which then made the last passenger journey to Lindley. Meanwhile, trolleybuses participating in the final procession had been assembling at St George's Square. These included 626 and 627. .623 was crewed by C.P. Jones with 30 years service and conductress Mona Lockwood with 25 years. Having made its penultimate trip to Out Lane, the cortege was joined by 629, crewed by driver Collinson and another long-serving conductress, Florence Whittaker. Watched by huge crowds, the cortege of 5 vehicles led by 626 and with 623 bringing up the rear departed for Waterloo at 2:30. On arrival, the 5 trolleybuses stopped on the loop before making the final cross-town journey. Climbing towards Out Lane at Marsh. "909 feet above sea level, Edgar Dyson, the general manager, shares a nostalgic memory or two with Mona Lockwood. John Maguire was the department's traffic superintendent. On board 623 had been many dignitaries, including the mayor, Tom Cliff. Back in the centre, 623 was towed to Great Northern Street Works to be stripped of its decorations prior to going for scrap. Last-minute permission was given for 629 to carry passengers on its very last trip to the depot, making it the final trolleybus to run through the Huddersfield streets. By 4 o'clock, it was all over. Only 6 other undertakings survived Huddersfield, and by 1972 these 2 would have disappeared. This tape is dedicated to Roy Brooke, foremost expert on Huddersfield's trams and trolleybuses. It is his films of the sleek red and cream vehicles which served the town so splendidly for over 34 years which have featured prominently in this video. Gone now were the electric buses, which were once advertised for business and pleasure, for walking, hiking and rambling. Almondbury for Mollica Woods, Out Lane for Scammerdon, Birkby for Grimes Car Woods.
Well, hello, it's your old mate Dave Spencer back with you again. How did you enjoy that trip down memory lane with work carried out by Wilf Waters and Martin Jenkins all those years ago, and of course all the contributors who were listed on the credits? And the release of these films is to draw attention to the wonderful work done by the OTA in preserving original media, be the slides and stills or cine, and preserving it for posterity. So thank you for joining us, and anybody out there with collections that they think need to be put somewhere for safekeeping, should their unlikely event of a person's demise, that the world is assured to carry on appreciating their work. So on behalf of myself and all at OTA, bye for now. Thank you very much for viewing. Bye.